My dad looked me straight in the eye, slid a folded check across the table, and said, "This is more than enough for you to manage." My fingers trembled as I opened it. $12,000. That was the number written in neat blue ink. The number he believed could replace the home my mother left me, the lakeside cottage that had been appraised at $3 million just 6 months earlier. My breath caught in my throat as if I had been slapped. He didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He just sat back in his leather chair as though he had done me a favor, as though handing me this pitiful sum was an act of generosity. I remember the sound of my own heartbeat in that moment, louder than his voice, louder than the creak of the old wooden floor beneath my chair. I had grown up in that cottage, watching sunrises from the dock, falling asleep to the waves tapping gently against the shore. Every corner of that place carried my mother's handwriting, her presence, her legacy to me. And now it was gone. Sold behind my back, stripped away as though my memories had no value, as though my inheritance could be traded for his quick profit. I stared at him, at the man who raised me, and I realized something I never thought I would. This wasn't about money. This was about power, about control. And that realization burned hotter than the betrayal itself. I was 29, not a child, not naive, yet in that moment I felt like he had shrunk me down to nothing. The cottage wasn't just property, it was the last thread tying me to my mother after she passed. She had decorated it with her own hands. The lilac curtains in the upstairs bedroom, the chipped porcelain knobs on the kitchen drawers, even the uneven stones lining the garden path that she and I had collected on our walks. Every summer of my childhood was built there, every holiday dinner, every whispered conversation under the stars. And to him, to my father, it was just a line item, just an asset to liquidate when he felt like padding his accounts. When he gave me that check, I swear I could feel the weight of his arrogance pressing against my chest. $12,000 wouldn't even cover one season of upkeep on the cottage, and he knew it. That's what made it cruel. The deliberate message behind it. It was his way of telling me, you are small, you have no say. I decide what your life is worth. I left his house with that slip of paper crushed in my fist, the ink already smudging under the sweat of my palm. The air outside was cold, sharp, and I remember standing on the front steps, trying to breathe, trying not to scream. The betrayal echoed in my bones, but beneath the grief, something else began to form. It was quiet, steady, and stronger than I expected. It was resolve. Because if he thought I would let him write me out of my own story with the stroke of a pen, he had no idea who I was becoming. I didn't go home that night. I drove straight to the lake, parked at the end of the gravel road, and walked down the familiar path toward the cottage I thought was still mine. The for sale sign was gone, the lights inside glowed warm, and through the window I saw silhouettes moving. Strangers, laughing, making themselves comfortable in the space where my mother once stood cooking her famous blueberry pies. My chest tightened so hard it felt like my ribs might crack. The cottage was already gone, papers signed, keys handed over, and I hadn't even been told until after the fact. I stood outside like a ghost, invisible in the place where I belonged. My dad had always been like this, controlling, dismissive, convinced that as his daughter I owed him obedience rather than independence. Growing up, every decision I tried to make for myself was met with his smirk, his reminder that he knew better. When I got my first job at 19, he told me to quit because it was embarrassing for his daughter to work in retail. When I started dating seriously, he told me none of them were good enough for our family name. And when Mom got sick, he decided which treatments she'd try, which doctors she'd see, as though her own wishes didn't matter. I remember watching her fade not just from illness, but from exhaustion, from the constant fight to be heard. And now, even in death, he had silenced her voice again by selling the one thing she left me. I sat in my car staring at that house until dawn, strangers drinking coffee in my kitchen, a golden retriever chasing a ball across the dock. All of it felt like a theft so personal, so calculated. It stole the air from my lungs. I drove back into town, past the real estate office where I knew his signature still lingered on those sale documents, past the bank where he deposited the millions while deciding I was worth $12,000. I pulled into a quiet parking lot and opened my laptop. For hours, I dug. I pulled property records, tax statements, archived deeds. My dad had taught me to be silent, but my mother had taught me to be resourceful, to write everything down, to never let someone's word be the only version of truth. And there, buried in county records, I found what I was looking for. The line in my mother's will that left the cottage to me exclusively, not to my husband and daughter, not to be divided among heirs, but to me by name. My father had sold property that legally wasn't his. That discovery changed everything. It was no longer grief, no longer helplessness, it was evidence, and evidence meant power. I printed every document I found, slid them into a folder, and carried it with me like a shield. For days I replayed this scene at my father's house, his smug expression when he pushed that check across the table, the condescension in his tone when he said, "This is more than enough for you." I realized then it wasn't just about money, it was about his need to keep me under his thumb, to remind me that he controlled the narrative. But this time, he had overplayed his hand. The cottage wasn't his to sell. He hadn't just betrayed me emotionally, he had broken the law. I booked an appointment with a lawyer, a woman named Claire, who came highly recommended. Sitting in her office, surrounded by shelves stacked with leather-bound casebooks, I laid out everything. The will, the deed, the sale documents, even the pitiful check my father had given me. She flipped through the papers, her expression shifting from polite neutrality to sharp focus. "He had no legal right to sell this property," she said firmly, tapping the section of the will that bore my name. "This was yours. It still is yours. And what he's done is fraud." The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Fraud. My father, the man who prided himself on being untouchable, had committed a crime in broad daylight. Claire leaned forward, her voice steady, almost clinical. "We can pursue civil action immediately. You have an airtight case. The buyers will likely have to return the property, and your father could face charges if we push criminally. The question is, how far do you want to take this?" I sat there, silent, my hands folded tightly in my lap. I thought of my mother's voice, soft but firm, telling me not to let him bully me, not to let him shrink me down. For the first time in my life, I felt her beside me, urging me to choose myself. "I want everything," I told Claire. "The cottage, restitution, and I want him exposed for what he did." She nodded once, decisively, and I felt something shift deep inside me. For years I had carried the weight of his authority like chains around my neck. That day I felt them snap. The first step was filing the lawsuit. The second step was silence. I didn't tell my father what I knew, didn't warn him, didn't give him time to prepare. I let him think he had won, let him think his daughter had slunk away with her $12,000 consolation prize. Meanwhile, Claire worked quietly, drafting motions, securing injunctions, freezing accounts. Every phone call, every email tightened the net around him. And then, one cold Tuesday morning, I watched his world crack open. A sheriff's deputy knocked on his door and served him with papers. The look on his face when he realized what was happening, that was worth more than any check, more than any dollar amount. It was the moment he understood that the little girl he thought he could control was gone, replaced by a woman who had receipts, lawyers, and the law on her side. And that was only the beginning. The news traveled faster than I imagined. Within 48 hours of the sheriff serving him, my phone lit up with messages from relatives, neighbors, even people I hadn't spoken to in years. "What happened with your dad? Why is there a court filing with your name on it? Did he really sell the cottage? He must have thought he could keep it quiet, sweep it under the rug as just another one of his business decisions." But the lawsuit was public record, and people were reading every word. I stayed silent. That was the hardest part. Not rushing to defend myself, not screaming my side of the story to anyone who asked. Claire told me, "Let the documents speak. The more he talks, the worse it will get for him." And she was right, because my father couldn't keep his mouth shut. He told anyone who would listen that I was ungrateful, that I was trying to ruin him, that the cottage wasn't really hers anyway. But every time he opened his mouth, he only drew more attention to the very papers that proved he was lying. The buyers of the cottage were furious. They had thought they purchased a dream home on the lake, only to find out the seller didn't have clear title. They hired their own attorney who quickly joined forces with mine. Suddenly, it wasn't just me against my father, it was me. And the new owners, side by side, both of us demanding justice. I sat in the back of the courtroom during the first hearing, my hands clenched in my lap as the judge listened to arguments. My father, red-faced and sweating, tried to charm his way out of it, talking about family misunderstandings and miscommunications. But Claire cut through his excuses like glass. She read aloud the section of the will that bore my name. She displayed the signed deed from the county records. She pointed directly at my father and said, "He knowingly and willfully sold property that was never his." The silence in that courtroom was absolute. I'll never forget the judge leaning back in his chair, adjusting his glasses and saying, "This is serious, Mr. Hart, very serious." For the first time in my life, I saw fear flicker across my father's face. Not annoyance, not anger, fear. And in that moment, I knew I had already won. Because it wasn't just about the cottage anymore. It was about taking back my voice. It was about showing him and everyone else that I wasn't someone he could buy off with a check and a dismissive smile. And as the proceedings dragged on, as motions were filed and hearings were scheduled, I realized something else. This battle was no longer just for me. It was for my mother. For every time he had spoken over her, silenced her, treated her as less. Taking the cottage back was reclaiming her voice, too. And I wasn't going to stop until the house was mine again. Until the world knew exactly what kind of man he really was. The weeks that followed were like watching a carefully stacked tower collapse one block at a time. My father, who had always carried himself like the most respected man in town, suddenly found himself cornered from every angle. The buyers demanded not only their money back, but damages for emotional distress and the cost of relocating. My lawsuit demanded full restitution, the return of the cottage, and legal fees covered in full. And the county prosecutor began quietly sniffing around, considering whether his actions constituted criminal fraud. He tried everything to regain control. First, he called me late at night, his voice low and sharp. "You're making a fool of yourself, Isabella. Drop this now, and I'll make sure you're taken care of." Taken care of. The same phrase he had used when he shoved that $12,000 check into my hand. I didn't answer. I let his words hang in the air, meaningless. Then he tried guilt. Long emails full of accusations about family loyalty, telling me I was destroying my mother's memory by dragging his name through court. That one almost broke me. Almost. Until I remembered the lilac curtains, the chipped porcelain knobs, the garden stones. My mother had left those for me, not for him to erase. And finally, when none of that worked, he tried rage. Threats of cutting me off from the rest of the family, of rewriting his will, of making sure I was alone forever. But here's the thing. I had already been alone for a long time. What he never understood was that I had built my own strength in the silence he forced on me. The more he raged, the calmer I became. Because I had something stronger than his fury. I had truth. The second court hearing was the turning point. Claire laid everything out in a methodical timeline. My mother's will, the date of the fraudulent sale, the bank transfers of $3 million into my father's personal accounts. Then she held up the check, the same one I had crushed in my fist weeks earlier, and said to the judge, this was his idea of compensation for stealing her inheritance. The judge's face hardened. "Mr. Hart," he said, "you had no authority to sell this property. The law is clear. The deed remains in your daughter's name, and your actions constitute fraudulent transfer. The cottage will be returned immediately." My father's face drained of color. For once, the smirk was gone. His jaw tightened, his hands shook, and he didn't say a word. He couldn't. Because in that instant, the image he had built of himself, the untouchable patriarch, the man who always knew best, cracked wide open for everyone to see. I left the courthouse with tears burning behind my eyes, not from sadness, but from the fierce relief of finally being heard. The cottage was mine again. My mother's voice had been restored, and my father, for all his power and arrogance, had been forced to kneel before the truth. Taking back the cottage should have felt like the end, but in reality, it was only the beginning of unraveling everything my father had built on lies. The Judge's ruling meant the buyers were refunded in full, but not from me, from him. He had to wire back millions that he had already spent flaunting a lifestyle of control, and suddenly the cracks in his empire became gaping holes. His investments were tied up, his account stretched thin, and the people who once praised him for his business genius now whispered about his recklessness in grocery store aisles and church pews. For once, I didn't hide from the whispers. I walked into town with my head high, shoulders back, and let them look at me. Let them see the daughter he once tried to silence now standing taller than him, and every time I did, I caught myself thinking of Mom, how she used to lower her voice at family dinners, how she used to fold her hands neatly in her lap while he held court, speaking for both of them. That silence had ended with me. But victory came with shadows, too. He didn't stop trying to claw his way back into control. Letters arrived at my door, full of bitterness and venom, accusing me of betrayal. Calls came late at night, sometimes just breathing on the other end of the line. Relatives who had once embraced me now parroted his lines. Family should stick together. Don't you think you've punished him enough? They didn't see what I saw. They didn't live in that courtroom, didn't watch him stripped of his mask in front of strangers. They didn't carry the memory of a $12,000 check meant to erase a lifetime of love and inheritance. I kept the check, not to cash, not to frame, but as a reminder. It sat in my desk drawer, tucked between legal documents and receipts, a symbol of the value he once put on me. And every time I opened that drawer, I reminded myself, never again. Still, the hardest part wasn't fighting him. It was walking back into the cottage. The first time I unlocked the door, the house smelled different, lived in by strangers for those few months. Their furniture still lingered, their curtains, their marks on the walls. For a moment I froze, afraid the place had been ruined beyond repair. But then I stepped inside and closed my eyes. The echoes of my childhood returned. The creak of the floorboards, the faint hum of the lake outside, the memory of my mother's laughter as she set a pie on the counter. I knew then that no one could take it from me again. This battle had been about more than property. It had been about reclaiming myself, about breaking free from decades of control, about proving that I was not a girl to be bought off, but a woman who could stand her ground. And as I stood in that cottage, the weight of the key in my palm, I realized my father's greatest mistake wasn't selling the house. It was underestimating me. Summer arrived before I realized it, and the cottage became mine in ways it had never been when I was a child. I repainted the shutters a deep green, just like Mom had wanted but never convinced Dad to do. I planted flowers along the stone path, the same stones she and I had gathered, and for the first time in years, the garden bloomed without anyone telling me it was impractical or a waste of time. Friends came to visit, sitting on the dock with glasses of wine, and they marveled at the view, at the calm, at the story behind it all. He really thought 12,000 could erase this? One of them asked, shaking her head in disbelief. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. That check, once a symbol of my father's power over me, had turned into a relic of his downfall. Every time I saw it tucked away in my drawer, I remembered the expression on his face in court, pale, trembling, speechless. He still tried, of course. Word filtered back to me that he was spreading lies, telling anyone who would listen that I had manipulated the system, that I had stolen what was rightfully his. But fewer people believed him now. Respect is a fragile currency, and he had squandered his. One afternoon, I received a call from Claire. The buyers settled their case, she said, her voice calm but tinged with satisfaction. Your father had to pay them damages on top of the refund. He's liquidating assets. He won't recover from this easily. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where my mother once kneaded bread, and let out a slow breath. Justice wasn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it was paperwork, signatures, and the steady erosion of a man's facade until nothing was left but the truth. And the truth was, he had tried to steal my inheritance, and instead, he had lost everything. Late one evening, as the sun melted into the horizon and the lake turned gold, I stood on the dock alone. The air was warm, the water calm, and for the first time in a long time, I felt peace. Not just because I had won, but because I had broken the cycle. My father's grip on me had ended. The cottage wasn't just a home anymore. It was proof that I could fight back, that I could take what was mine and protect it. And in that quiet moment, I whispered to the memory of my mother, "We did it." He didn't disappear quietly. My father clung to whatever scraps of authority he thought he still had, calling distant relatives, sending long-winded letters full of self-pity, and even trying to show up at the cottage uninvited. The first time I saw his car pulling down the gravel road, my stomach clenched, but I didn't hide. I walked out onto the porch, stood with the sun at my back, and waited as he rolled down the window. His face was gaunt, older somehow, the stress of lawsuits and lost millions carving deep lines where arrogance used to live. "You've ruined me," he spat, his voice thin, almost desperate. "Do you understand that? You've destroyed your own father." I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just looked at him, steady and calm, and said the words I had rehearsed in my head for weeks. "No. You ruined yourself the moment you tried to steal from me." His mouth opened, but nothing came out. For once, there was no speech, no performance, no thunderous lecture about family loyalty or respect. Just silence. I turned and walked back inside, locking the door behind me, and he sat there for a long moment before finally driving away. That was the last time I saw him in person. After that, everything shifted. The cottage became more than a house. It was my sanctuary, my proof that I could withstand him. I hosted friends. I built new traditions. I let laughter and music fill the rooms where silence had once dominated. Sometimes, I would sit by the window at night and imagine my mother beside me, smiling at the strength I had found. And every time I thought of that $12,000 check, the insult that was meant to shrink me down, I realized it had done the opposite. It had lit a fire that nothing could put out. My father had tried to reduce my life, my worth, my inheritance to a scrap of paper. Instead, he gave me the greatest gift without realizing it. The chance to finally break free, to reclaim what was mine, to stand taller than his shadow. And as I locked the door of the cottage each night, the lake humming outside like a lullaby, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would never control me again. The months after his final visit were strangely quiet, almost unsettling at first, like living in the eye of a storm after years of constant thunder. But slowly, I began to understand that the silence wasn't emptiness. It was freedom. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't wake up bracing myself for his calls, his judgments, or his manipulations. Instead, I woke to the sound of the lake brushing against the dock, to bird song drifting through the open window, to a life that finally belonged to me. I threw myself into restoring the cottage, not just as a home, but as a promise kept. Every wall I repainted felt like erasing a piece of his control. Every flower I planted in the garden felt like planting a future my mother would have wanted for me. Friends told me I seemed lighter, as though I had shed a skin I'd been forced to wear for too long. And they were right. Even my laughter sounded different, freer, unchained. Meanwhile, my father's reputation collapsed piece by piece. The same people who once flocked to his side at dinner parties now avoided his calls. Business partners withdrew, family members stopped defending him, and even the relatives who once pressured me to drop it for the sake of peace began to see the truth for themselves. His downfall wasn't a dramatic explosion. It was a slow unraveling, one thread at a time, until the man who once towered over me was reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale whispered about in town. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. That was never the point. My victory was quieter, deeper. It was in the evenings I spent on the porch with a glass of wine, watching the sun melt into the horizon without dread gnawing at me. It was in the moments I unlocked the door to the cottage and felt my mother's presence instead of his shadow. It was in the steady realization that I had rewritten the ending he tried to script for me. He thought I would take the $12,000 check, bow my head, and disappear into silence. Instead, I took him to court, exposed him, and reclaimed what was rightfully mine. And more than that, I reclaimed myself. The truth is, the cottage was always worth more than money. It was history, love, memory, and legacy wrapped into walls, and beams and lake air. By selling it, My father thought he was cashing in on all of that. What he didn't understand was that some things can't be sold, can't be erased, can't be bought back once they're stolen. That's the part he never grasped. But I did. And as I stood on that dock night after night, the water reflecting, the stars above me, I knew that the story of my life had shifted forever. My father no longer defined me, his betrayal no longer defined me. What defined me now was survival, resilience, and the strength to fight back when everyone expected me to stay quiet. And that was worth more than $3 million, more than any check, more than his approval ever could have been. The final chapter of this story didn't happen in a courtroom or in some dramatic confrontation. It happened in the quiet moments afterward, when I realized I no longer flinched at the sound of my phone, no longer replayed his words in my head, no longer felt the sting of needing his approval. The cottage stood strong at the edge of the lake, and with each passing season it became more mine than it had ever been. In the spring, I hosted my closest friends there, filling the air with laughter, candles burning late into the night, the dock covered in blankets as we watched the stars. In the summer, I swam alone in the cool water at dawn, the surface shimmering, gold in the rising sun, and I felt a peace I hadn't known since I was a little girl holding my mother's hand on that same shoreline. In autumn, I painted the shutters again, not because they needed it, but because I wanted to. A small reminder that this home was alive, evolving, just like me. And in winter, with the snow piled high and the fireplace glowing, I sat wrapped, in a blanket with a book in my hands, and finally felt safe. My father faded from my daily life, his voice reduced to the occasional rumor, the occasional mention by a distant cousin who still hadn't grasped the full truth. I didn't need to respond, didn't need to correct them, because I knew the truth. The courts knew the truth, and the silence he lived in now was louder than any lie he could tell. Sometimes I thought about that $12,000 check, still tucked away in my drawer. I never tore it up, never threw it out, because it had become a symbol of everything I had overcome. That slip of paper was his attempt to put a price tag on my worth, to diminish me to nothing. Instead, it became the spark that ignited my fight, the proof that I could stand against him and win. And maybe one day I'll frame it, not as a wound, but as a victory. Because here's what I've learned. Revenge isn't always about fire and fury. Sometimes it's about patience, about outlasting the storm, about standing firm when someone tries to erase you. My revenge was not just reclaiming the cottage, but reclaiming myself, my dignity, my independence, my right to be heard. My father once told me that I would never survive without his guidance, that I was too soft, too dependent, too much my mother's daughter. And in a way, he was right. I am my mother's daughter. I am the woman who saved every receipt, who kept every record, who remembered that love is stronger than fear. I am the woman who stood up when silence would have been easier, who fought not just for a house, but for a legacy. And when I sit on the porch now, the lake stretching endlessly before me, the wind carrying the faint scent of lilacs from the garden, I feel her presence everywhere. In the curtains she sewed, in the stones she laid, in the courage she planted in me long ago. This is my inheritance. Not just the cottage, but the strength to claim it, the strength to live without apology, the strength to know that I am worth more than any check my father could ever write. And if there's one thing I want anyone listening to this story to remember, it's this. Family is not about obedience or silence or control. Family is about love, respect, and legacy. And when those things are stolen from you, you have every right to fight for them and win. So I'll leave you with the truth I carry now. I am not the girl he thought he could silence. I am the woman who took back her life. And I'll ask you what I still sometimes ask myself. Did I go too far? Or not far enough? Tell me in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe, because some stories of revenge deserve to be heard.